Hey, this is Covenant Fellowship's Community Group Fellowship Series. The goal of the series is to highlight our need for fellowship and to help lead us into meaningful and effective fellowship with one another. I do hope this series serves your community group and serves you in your personal walk with Christ. Good evening again, friends. Tonight, we focus on the importance of the role of listening in fellowship. When you sit in church week in and week out, you hear dozens and dozens of sermons each year. And for a sermon to be effective, it requires at least two things. It requires proclamation and it requires listening. And proclamation is not simply saying words loudly. It's communicating in such a way that truth lands with effectiveness. It helps the listener's mind and heart open and learn as the listener's heart is lifted up in worship. And I thank God, we all ought to thank God for the faithful preaching of good pastors that He's used throughout our lives. But that's only half of what's needed. For good preaching to be effective, it takes good listening. And this is outside of the preacher's hands. To truly listen, it takes more than sound passing through the ears to the ear canal and down to the eardrum. It starts there. That's necessary. But it doesn't stop there. True listening is hard work. It hears the words and it's processing the words. And it seeks not just to understand the point that the preacher's making, but it seeks to understand the implications of that point. It listens and applies and sifts truth down into living. Many a good sermon has failed because of a lack of good, careful listening. Being an effective listener when a gifted speaker is preaching, well, that can be hard enough. But when you're sitting in a circle, listening to someone share their thoughts, the effort level skyrockets. Now, they may lack clarity, or they could trip over themselves with their thoughts. They may use terms that try to keep you at a distance and keep the real issue shrouded. They may not even know the real reason behind what they're sharing. Proverbs 20 verse 5 says this, "The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out." Now listen to that. The purpose in a man's heart is deep water. Who draws it out? Not the man who owns the heart, but it's the man of understanding who's listening to the sharing of the heart. And this is why good listening is essential for fellowship to thrive. People will feel care if they are well listened to, even if you can't solve their problem. And so how do we grow in our ability to be good listeners when one another shares in our community groups? I've got a number of points here. The first one is this: listen with the speaker's best interests in view. Good listening places the other person's best interests first. We learned that from Philippians 2. And this is easier in a group setting, a formal setting like this, where you're only with that person for an hour and a half or 2 hours. This skill of listening can be much harder in a personal relationship, particularly if there's a disagreement or a brewing argument. But the goal is the same. We need to place the speaker's interests above ours when we're listening. God's ear is inclined toward our cry. We learn that in Psalm 34. And we need to follow suit so that our ears are inclined toward the cry or the sharing of the person who is talking. Second, we need to listen to understand rather than debate. If a person is speaking, especially if he or she is sharing something of personal value or deep privacy, The only fruitful way forward is to listen for understanding. If your mind is racing with ways to prove them wrong or point out their doctrinal error, or perhaps you decide really early in what they share exactly what they need, you're going to miss the purposes of God in that conversation. However, if you're intent on listening to understand, to hearing them out, then you are really well positioned to help that brother or that sister, and therefore serve the purposes and the will of God. Next, we want to listen with patience. Some people are able to share a very large thought in just a few words. Some people take many, many words to share a very small thought. And some use too few words and leave us wondering what they're talking about in the first place. Others use so many words that we lose track of time and we lose track of their point. And in all of these circumstances, we must listen with patience. Remember, in our communication with God, at any given time, we use too many words or too few words. At any given time, we're speaking with self-interest or being opaque. But God is patient with us, and He forbears, and He draws out our heart. So in turn, we are called to be patient with one another. We simply follow the instructions of the Apostle Paul from 1 Thessalonians 5. He says in verse 14, "And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all." Next, we listen for opportunities to ask questions. As you listen, consider ways to ask open-ended questions. Ask questions that will help you learn at a deeper level than you already know. Ask questions that will help the brother or sister who's sharing to share more thoroughly. And perhaps you do see where the crux of the problem is in what they're sharing. Well, don't jump to conclusions. Ask questions. And once you truly do see the problem, be slow in sharing what you think with that person. Find a way to ask a question. Help him or her discover the crux of their own problems for themselves. That way you help them not just with this problem, but you help them learn how to walk through the next challenge they face and the next challenge that they face. And then lastly, listen for gospel connections. We firmly believe that the gospel arches over and undergirds all of life. It has arms that reach into every corner of our lives and every fiber of our beings. So it should come as no surprise that there would be gospel connections lying just beneath the surface of each and every circumstance and experience in our lives and in the lives of others. So when someone is sharing, listen for those connections. When you discover one, find a gracious and skillful way to point it out. And when you do so, you help him or her to think like a Christian. You help them to come to the Word and to live in light of the gospel that has saved them. We're all familiar with James 1:19, where he tells us to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Let's lean on this call to listen. Let's do it well. As you do, you're going to be a source of great blessing to all who share with you, whether that's in your community group, in your home, in your workplace, just generally in your life. And listen, being a great source of blessing is a wonderful thing to pursue. Thanks for listening so carefully to this message. I pray you have a great discussion. God bless you guys.